thank you. Okay, great. And I am going to share my screen here. And I'm assuming that we can all see this okay? Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Great. So hello and welcome everyone to this NJCH grant application workshop, Creating an Outstanding Proposal. We're focusing on the budget in this session. And again, the purpose of this workshop here is really to do a deep dive on the budget of a grant application. There are a few reasons why this is important, specifically for grant seekers at our organization, right? The budget is actually one of our main review criteria in the evaluation process that we employ to assess the merits of applications here at NJCH. Sort of like I was saying in the previous session, our grant cycles have been pretty competitive lately. We've been funding at a rate of about 30 to 40% in the last few cycles. So that's, total number of applications funded versus total number of applications received. It's about 30 to 40%. The competition's pretty steep, so we literally cannot afford to not spend time talking about the budget, because it is in fact an area where applications often get criticism at the evaluation stage. In an extreme sense, it's an area where applications often fall apart, right? So this budget topic is really, really important to spend a lot of time on. There's a really common response that we get from grantees that we work with, prospective grant seekers, where folks assume, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm an English major with a background in literary studies. So, I've often thought to myself, I'm a humanities person. I don't do numbers. I'm allergic to them, kind of a thing. And so there is a sort of field or discipline specific concern among our grantees relative to the budget portion of these applications. And we just want to underscore that kind of response, right? I'm a humanities person. I don't do numbers. That comes from a fear place, right? And we don't want to make our decisions, on the basis of that. So the purpose of the workshop today is to kind of do a deep dive into budgets, just because they tend to be a kind of point of tension in a lot of the applications we assess. So definitely worth spending some time on today. Our specific agenda items are going to be the topic of right sizing your request, which is a really important principle that contributes a lot to successful applications. We'll talk a little bit about matching funds and how those work. We'll talk about indirect costs and what those are. We'll also talk about assigning value and best practices for assigning value to specifically the labor of your staff and your project team, in your application budget. We'll think together about the budget as kind of telling a story, right? And the important part to underscore there is that, the story the budget tells needs to be the same story that the project narrative tells, right? And you would assume that they would automatically kind of be the same story, but sometimes it falls out that, the project narrative describes one version of a project and the budget tells a slightly different version. And we'll talk a little bit about that with some examples as we go forward. Starting with right sizing your request, this is a good thing to start with because it's kind of the most difficult part of budgeting for pursuing grant opportunities with us. And we want to underscore it's important to remember that we only offer project grants, right? We don't currently offer general operating support. So a lot of the project work that you'd be seeking funding from us to support would need to be discrete work within your organization, right? It can't just be, the sort of general operating things that your organization does on a regular basis. It needs to be for a project that begins and ends within the grant period. A good best practice to keep in mind is to build your budget while you build the project. Ideally, building the budget first, I think. That's not too extreme to say. Building your budget simultaneously to building your project helps. Building it a little bit in advance helps a bit more. As you identify pieces of your project plan, it's a good habit to kind of keep some notes about associated expenses that will be incurred while you're going about fulfilling those pieces of the project plan. We'll look at this in an example in a few minutes, but that's just a good practice to kind of flag. Another consideration to keep in mind when you're right sizing your request is the size of your organization's annual budget. So when you're thinking about how much to request from NJCH as part of your application, you don't, and this applies more, I think, if you're a kind of smaller or medium-sized organization. You don't want to request the full $15,000 of a grant award if $15,000 is also in fact your organization's annual budget figure, right? Because there's a kind of capacity issue that emerges there. Some evaluators might question the extent to which you can spend out $15,000 of project funds if $15,000 of operating support funds are what's going through your organization in a given year in the first place, right? So the comparison of the requested funding amount to the organization's annual budget is an important piece to keep in mind when you're thinking about right sizing your request. Generally speaking, you'd want the requested award amount to be significantly smaller than your organization's annual budget, just to illustrate that the capacity thing is not an issue. Um, One thing that is really important to keep in mind that we'll dive into in more detail in the next slide here is that you have to match all of the funds that you request. So again, that kind of sort of dovetails with the capacity issue we were just discussing. Starting small and growing over time is never really a problem. But it is a problem if you request more funding than you can handle, or even more than you can match, right? And again, that matching funds requirement is something that kind of bears discussion at a little bit more length. So I'll spend some time talking about that here. Uh, so NJCH requires a minimum one-to-one match for all of the funds that we give out. For every dollar we give out, you're required to match those dollars with one-to-one match contributions. And just to kind of explain the rationale for that, NJCH isn't a federal agency, but we're kind of a pass-through independent nonprofit organization that regrants funds from the federal government. The federal agency that we regrant funding from, the National Endowment for the Humanities, requires us to match the funding that we get from them. So in turn, we require a minimum 1-1 match from our grantees to help us make our match to the NEH, the federal agency where we get our funds from. So you guys match because we match. It's not necessarily because we want to ask this from you. It's kind of because we have to. But we're pretty forgiving in terms of how that match gets made, right? It can be made with any combination of cash and in-kind contributions. A few definitions to lay out here. A cash match would be funds contributed to the project that come from any source other than us, right? So a cash contribution could be other grants, donations, monetary donations, general operating funds, etc. Any sort of funding that's contributed to the project from a source other than us, right? That would be a cash contribution. An in-kind contribution could be donated goods and services or volunteer time. So that's kind of how we understand that distinction there. Something important to keep in mind with making the match is that all of the expenses in your budget, both the requested amount as well as the matching amount, must be eligible expenses. So you can't have a mix of eligible and ineligible, like having all of the eligible expenses in the request column and then all of the ineligible ones in the match column. That everything needs to be eligible in order for that match to be appropriate. And there's detailed eligibility info on what we understand as an eligible expense in the grant guidelines, which are always available on our website. Some pretty common ineligible expenses, just to give you guys a sense of what these are, would be monetary awards, right? Scholarships and regrants, right? So generally speaking, we cannot give out money to organizations for those organizations to then give that money out again in some other kind of way, right? We can't fund an award, a scholarship, or a regrant at a nonprofit partner institution. We also can fund capital expenses. Unfortunately, if you guys want to buy any new houses across the street from your small historic house, you can't do that with our money. We can't support the purchase of alcohol either, as well as entertainment, broadly construed. So if you want to have a harpist play at one of your council-funded events, you can't request the cost of the harpist for that. So yeah, just to give you a general sense of what an ineligible expense would be from our perspective. Um, Another important point to underscore is that the total request needs to be matched, not each individual line item. So it could be that the request amount is all in one row on the budget, right? You could be requesting to pay one person's salary with your grant award. That's completely fine. And then you could then match that with donated goods and services contributions, the contributed time of other staff members. That match could happen across multiple line items as opposed to just one. So just to illustrate that. And one really important point is that indirect costs cannot be used as matching funds for a particular request. So indirect costs can only be included in your application as part of the request amount. That you can't use those as a match. So, and this is actually a neat segue into the slide that we have for indirect costs, because I'm sure one or two folks are kind of wondering what exactly we understand by that. When we say indirect costs, we mean essentially administrative costs or overhead, right? The cost of doing business that's incurred by your organization through the execution of day-to-day work, but which is not attached to a specific activity. For each individual grant application, you can request up to 10% of the total project expenses in the request as indirect costs. That's generally a good practice to do up to 10%. But that can only happen in the requested funds, as we said in the last slide. You can't apply those indirect costs to the matching fund requirement. You don't need to itemize indirect costs in the budget that you submit with your application. We actually recommend that you explicitly do not itemize those expenses. It's not an effective use of time. And if you have a NICRA, negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, with the federal government, if you're a particular kind of organization, then you can use the rate that's established by your NICRA. But be sure to use the rate that is appropriate for the type of work that's requested by the grant. So there's some federal guidelines about that. If you guys have a NICRA, you'll probably be familiar with them. And if you are using a NICRA rate as opposed to the 10% of project expenses rate, be sure to attach a copy of your NICRA to the application when you submit it, just so that we have all of that documentation squared away. Now that we've talked a little bit about indirect costs, we can talk a little bit about the question of market value of goods and services, right? And this especially, I think this is an important point, I think, when we're talking about the valuation of staff time specifically, which is a really common ask, in terms of the kinds of grant applications that we see in any given cycle. Ideally, you want to have realistic estimates for the market value of goods and services that you sort of describe in the application budget. It's important to underscore that you can't get more money if you estimate too low, but at the same time, during the grant period, you also need to spend out all of the funding that you do receive. So there is kind of a calculus to it in a way, right? You don't want to go too low because you can't just ask for more, but again, you don't want to go too high either because that presents more challenges once you come to the reporting period in terms of spending out your funds and everything. So kind of makes us underscores the importance of right sizing your request sort of at the outset of the application process, right? So those realistic estimates are a pretty key thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about right sizing your request and asking how much money you're asking from us. We notice, from our perspective at the desk here, that volunteer time is often critically undervalued in applications, and this is obviously like a major issue for the philanthropy sector as a whole. But it's something that we keep in mind here at NJCH. And there's this organization called the Independent Sector that has a lot of really great publicly available nonprofit info, including a sort of regularly updated annual evaluation of volunteer time that's based on location. So the figures that I have in my notes from 2022 are that we were at $31.80 nationally for 1 hour of volunteer time. And that was back in 2022, and then it was $33.82 in New Jersey for each hour of volunteer time. So I believe there is a link that we have in our notes that Gigi can possibly share out through the chat, just so that everyone has access to that. That's a really great resource in terms of estimating the value of the time that your volunteers will be contributing to a particular project. If you're not working with volunteers, if you're working mostly with external consultants, it is in fact completely normal to ask someone what they would charge for a particular service provided to an organization. Even before you secure any commitments to participate in a given project or a given scope of work, right? It's okay to ask for a kind of draft quote or a sample estimate, right? That those kinds of conversations are definitely very important to have as you're putting your budget together for the application as you submit. Written estimates for goods and services can actually be attached to your proposal under the section for optional support materials. So that if you've started making those kinds of inquiries, you can include that written estimate in your application supplemental materials, just to illustrate to evaluators that you've kind of done the thinking there and that you're incorporating that into your planning for the project. And this brings us to a point that that I talked a little bit about at the beginning, which is that, as well as in the previous session, which is that NJCH really doesn't fund ideas, we fund projects, right? And keeping in mind that the purpose of this workshop today is to help prospective applicants move from having that really great idea to having a really strong project or proposal. NJCH funds the project, we don't fund the idea. And competitive grant applications are going to show us that project, right? As distinct from the idea. There's going to be a plan for how you're going to accomplish the goals of the project, including the costs, right? Cost estimates are a really, really important part of a strong plan. And a strong plan is what makes a project different from an idea, like more substantive than just an idea, right? So you need to have an idea of how much something is going to cost in order to effectively plan to achieve that work, right? So evaluators, when they're assessing the merits of your applications, they read through your project plans and then they look for those plans to be reflected in the budget itself, right? There's a point in an application evaluation where evaluators are literally looking between the project narrative and the budget as these two separate but overlapping documents. And they're trying to get a sense that the budget and the project narrative are both telling the same story, right? The project narrative actually does need to be reflected in the specific line items that show up in the budget, right? If you mention, for example, in your proposal that you are hiring a consultant, then we need to see the cost of that consultant reflected in your budget, right? That's a kind of basic example. If your project is going to run for 6 months in total, right? If the grant period for the project is going to be 6 months in total, then all of your cost estimates need to be based around 6 months of work, right? At the rates that you've negotiated with your service providers, right? There's a good example of it isn't fully described in my notes here, but we've talked about this at the NJCH office a few times. There's a smaller historic organization a couple years back that was seeking funding for a walking tour from NJCH. They wanted to do a walking tour, and it was a really well done proposal. All the different pieces and components kind of laid out pretty well in the project narrative, which was also well written. But for some reason in the budget, there was a line item for buses, which was like a couple grand or a couple $100s that they'd requested for buses specifically for the purposes of putting on this walk-in tour. And the buses were not described at any point in the project narrative itself, right? That expense, that line item wasn't justified or substantiated in the narrative that went along with the budget. So that was a question that evaluators had asked. And when NJCH staff circled back to the applicant for clarification about this particular line item in the budget, it came out that they needed money to request buses to bus people from the organization's location to the beginning of the walking tour. So it was a pretty straightforward line item that made a lot of sense in terms of the work of the project as a whole and the total scope of work that they wanted to accomplish. But because that particular line item wasn't meaningfully substantiated in the project narrative, they ran into some snags at the evaluation stage. That's kind of an example of the sort of thing that we're talking about when we're talking about the budget as a story, right? Each of those line items needs to be supported by or substantiated by an explanation in the narrative portion of your application. It's kind of like if anyone has kids and you've helped your kids out with math homework, right? You need to show your work, right? You need to show, the evidence of all of the cost estimates that you've done, all of the specific tasks and outcomes that you've identified as part of your project. The budget is really the place for you to show that you've done that work, right? For example, if a project director associated with a particular project makes $50,000 a year as a salary, and this project will take 10% of their time for 1 year, then it becomes really clear why the ask for the project director's salary on the application is $5,000, right? Because again, that's like kind of 10% of their time that they're contributing towards the project for a year. A sort of brief description of how you arrived at the figure that you have in the budget actually helps evaluators to assess how realistic that budget actually is, right? And there's space in the application to provide some more narrative detail on your budget if needed. We definitely encourage you guys to make the most of that space as you're working through the application process. Competitive grants are going to have a kind of simple and clear budget associated with them, where all of the cost estimates and the expenses are realistic and they all kind of make sense in terms of the narrative that you've submitted along with that budget. Often just by looking at the budget, we can determine a lot about the proposal, even without reading the project narrative as a whole. A lot of evaluators like to start with the budget and then work over to the narrative from there. So just to kind of give you guys a sense of how important those documents are for competitive applications. So returning to the sample project that we discussed briefly in the narrative portion of the workshop a little bit ago, we already looked at this project, so I'll just go over it again super briefly. This project, To Be Good Neighbors, was put on by the Roebling Museum in Roebling, New Jersey. This was part of a 2021 incubation grant award that organization had received from us. And in their proposal, the Roebling Museum described how their community had urged them to preserve a house which was located across the street from the museum, which offered, an authentic example of, particular historic architecture and living conditions at a particular point in 20th century history. They secured funds to make this capital acquisition, and they ended up purchasing the house, and now they own it. Their question in their incubation grant application was to think about how they might use the opportunity of this capital acquisition to create connection and growth in their community. And this application scored very well in that particular cycle. So I thought it might make sense for us to take a look at their budget together here, which I've reproduced on this slide, just so that we can see how these documents sort of look in the wild and how a sort of well put together budget actually sort of looks. So I wonder if I might actually ask people to use the chat or unmute themselves at this point. I might just ask the audience a few questions here. So just looking at the specific line items in this budget here, um, what do we think we know about this project just based on that budget? Anyone have any guesses? Maybe we can volunteer some stuff in the chat or by unmuting ourselves.
The staff is really working with the consultant. They're asking for money for a consultant.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, there's a lot of staff costs for sure. And specifically, there's costs for consultants, right? So there's two line items here under project personnel, one for a consultant named Sarah, one for a consultant named Michelle. They are requesting some funding to compensate their executive director too, as well as some supplies costs and some indirect costs as well, although they are requesting under that 10% ceiling that we discussed a while back. So the major expense with this budget, as Lisa pointed out for us, is the personnel costs. So paying people. This is almost always the case with grant applications that we see here at NJCH. That's typically the major expense is compensating folks involved, with the project team in some way, shape, or form. This request, I mean, it from our perspective, it's right-sized. They are requesting the maximum, award amount here, but this was reasonable on the organization's budget at the time. It's a lot smaller than their average organizational budget for a particular year. So we know from an evaluation standpoint that this is for a discrete project. It's not general operating support or general operating expenses. Another question for the group, how did they do on the match requirement? Did this organization satisfy the match requirement for this grant application?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Right, the
Seeing that,
total
yes.
is, right, their total is 15, they're matching 16. But so you're saying that it's okay to take the percentage of the staff that's working on this project. So if I have staff who's working on the project internally, I can use that as the match, but then I can also use additional staff time if they're going to be the facilitators or like run the sessions and do that. That works, correct? Like that could be in the request line because they're actually like facilitating the actual sessions going on. That same person also might be the project manager, but that would be sort of the match piece, right, of their time.
Yes,
You put
Lisa,
that in both.
you're absolutely correct. That is 100%. I don't want to say it's the most common way that people make matches, but you see it a lot. And it's and it's always a cash match, right? When you're kind of making that match with the contribution of additional staff time, because again, like it probably wouldn't be reasonable to expect their executive director to contribute too much, uncompensated time to a project that is going to be occupying their organization for some time. So when folks use their uncommitted staff time as a match for a particular project, the understanding is that our organization is providing an award to compensate part of their staff salaries for the duration of the grant period, and then the organization compensates the rest. So that's kind of how this looks, right? That's kind of how that sort of arrangement looks from the perspective of the budget. It'll look something like this, where you have this amount in the cash match here for the executive director's salary, and this clearly matches and even exceeds the match slightly the match requirement slightly because they're coming in at $16,100 as opposed to that 15. So they've definitely satisfied the matching requirement associated with this grant application. And it's also pretty clear where they got the match funds from, because again, like it's a cash match, so it's understood that it's coming from the organization's other sources of funding, besides what they would receive from our organization. Indirect costs are under 10%, as we discussed. And you know, I mean, you can't see it in this image, obviously, but they did attach you know, cost estimates from their two consultants as part of their application. So kind of a model budget, ticks all of the boxes in terms of what we're looking for from a strong application budget. So that's about that for the sample that I
Sylvester,
thought we could look at. Oh yes, Gigi, yes.
sorry, before you move on from this, can you go back to your other slide really quick?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
there was a note in the chat asking, can we assume from this that 19,500 is 30% of the ED's salary? And the answer in this case is yes. So they're saying the executive director is going to spend 30% of her, in this case, time on this project. We're assuming that if you combine the request from NJCH plus the cash match, which equals 19,500, that's 30% of her salary. In this case, we don't provide this information to you, but this was a 1-year project. So that's based on 1 year. If this was something like a 6-month project, you would anticipate her salary to be the calculation to include only that portion of her salary, if that makes sense. And then just one more thing that I wanted to jump in on based on what Lisa was talking about. Yes, you absolutely can request staff costs either as part of the request or to utilize it in the match. I also want to be very clear that project planning is something you could ask for. It doesn't have to just be the doing. The planning is often the doing in a lot of these cases. So yes, things like your staff being facilitators, your staff being leaders, your staff, you know, writing labels for an exhibit, whatever it is, absolutely, that's really easy to see as a staff cost that you could request. But the actual work of making a project happen involves a lot of administrative work, and that administrative work can be compensated through an NJCH grant as well. I just want to be very, very clear about that. Cash, as in terms of both match and request, staff costs can be allocated into either column.
Thanks for underscoring those points, Gigi. It's really important to kind of outline that. And again, this is kind of why we have two funding streams, right? Incubation and action. Like when you think about, you know, a grant project, you think of something like an action grant where you're seeking funding to do a thing, but we specifically do have a funding stream that is for planning and development. So the budgets for that can often look a little bit different, and sometimes the same, you know, from projects like this one, but yeah, so that is, I think, does anyone have any questions about this sample? Just before we move on to the last slide that I've got queued up here. Does anyone have any last questions about this example? Hearing none, going to keep moving forward. So a few reminders. Again, NJCH staff do offer a draft review to our grant seeking community. We recommend that you submit by April 3rd, you know, drafts for our review in case you'd like a second pair of eyes to look over your application. Definitely get that to us by April 3rd. If we receive it after that date, we will probably not be able to get back in touch with you before, you know, in time for that final grant deadline on April 16th at midnight. We also want to encourage you guys to set up grant consultations with program staff if you feel like that'd be useful, myself or Gigi. You know, with or without draft review, we're happy to chat, you know, really at whatever stage you're at in terms of preparing an application. Like Gigi was saying, I think at the end of the last session, drafts can be real drafty, you know, just bulleted lists, even if you know, if you're at that stage. So you guys can look out for the award notification for this cycle that will come out by June 30th. really the week before, but by June 30th at the latest. So that, I think, as they say, is that. I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen now. And I'll leave a little bit of space at the end here for any questions that anyone has about the content of the slides or budgeting or best practices for fiscal responsibility, stuff like that.
Hey, Sylvester, there's a question that I got in the chat that I actually want to bring up to the whole group, which is there's actually two parts to this that I'd like to talk about for the whole group because they're really, really important. The question came up: as a volunteer grant writer, can your hours be included as an in-kind match for writing this grant? I'm going to answer that question, and then I'd like to talk about how it applies to actually a bigger question. So the answer is no. Your hours writing this grant cannot be applied, nor could they if you are a director of development and it was a cash match. It couldn't be used toward your cash or toward a cash request. And there are two reasons for that. One, among the ineligible expenses is fundraising expenses. So expenses that are specifically fundraising related are actually ineligible expenses for NJCH grants. So that's one part of the reason. But the bigger reason, and the reason I wanted to bring this up for the full group, is that those are expenses that are incurred before the grant period. So your grant period, all of the expenses associated for your grant must be incurred during your grant period. Your grant period begins within 3 months of award. So in this case, in this round, it would be between July 1st and March 30th. September 30th, excuse me. July 1st and September 30th is when your grant has to start. And then you have a year, up to a year. You don't have to take a year. I should be very clear about that too. Some projects are 6 months long or 9 months long or whatever is going to be good for you. But all of your expenses, both in terms of what you're requesting and your match, have to be incurred during that grant period. So anything that you've spent money on up to the grant period cannot be included in your grant request or in your match. And anything after your grant close cannot be included after the match. So I wanted to bring that up for everybody because it's actually a bigger question for the whole group. So let us know if you have any additional questions about that or about anything else.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you, Gigi, for underscoring those really important points. Definitely want to second everything that Gigi just said. We're constantly available as resources to you guys in case any questions come up throughout the application process. I'm going to go ahead and throw my email in the chat. You can also reach us pretty quickly at our grants at email address, which I'll just throw in the chat as well. And typically it'll be me responding to emails that go there, but in case I'm out, Gigi will, be sure to get you guys taken care of. But yeah, we definitely invite you to keep the conversation going, whether over email or in a grants consultation meeting with us. Best of luck to all of you with your in-progress applications. Do want to, hold some space for that as well. And yeah, if there are no further questions from the group, then we'll definitely wish you all well on your way. All the best for the rest of the week, and stay in touch. So.